Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ruslan Greenberg. I will be moderating the second session of the Moscow Economic Forum. As you may have noticed, the first plenary session was quite explosive in nature, quite active, without a lot of discussion. On the one hand, this is good, because everyone seems to be in agreement, but on the other hand, this is something that saddens me because I didn't have any defenders of the official economic policy there, and that's probably putting the situation askew. But maybe it's an indication of the fact that things have gone too far, and we need to try and climb out of that stagnation we find ourselves in. But we are not alone in this world. This is the world that is inhabited by 7.5 billion people, and in our country we have the population of only 140 million. And it just happens so, and that's my take of it, is that we are finding ourselves in a kind of a geopolitical solace or isolation. Nobody, I mean, probably not everyone would agree with me, but that's my perception. And we need to understand how we have come to this, how it has come to this. How can this be possible that the Cold War may have already returned? Maybe we still have the chance to avoid it. And the biggest issue we need to deal with is how do we act to get out of this conundrum? How do we improve our relations with our neighbors and other nations, the relations that have become more tense over the last several months and years? And it seems that the society is kind of war-minded, and I'm afraid of the fact that maybe the uncontrolled arms race is about to begin and is beginning, and the sides are not playing by any rules, are leaving agreements and pacts, and we don't know how to deal with that. But at this plenary session, we have very important experts in this field, very serious experts, and I would like to introduce them to you so that you could see what we are going to begin with. And the very first thing I would like to address is the threat to the world peace, however terrible it may sound. And Valery Garbuzov represents the Institute of the United States and Canada. He is the director of the Institute and the executive dean of the Zhongyang Institute of Financial Studies of the Renmin University of China, Wang Wen. And I'm sitting in the middle, not by accident, between the two giants, the retiring superpower to my right and the emerging superpower to my left. And for Russia, this is a very hard choice. Each of the two states wants to become its younger partner, and we do not want to agree to that role. Whether we do it the right thing or not, that's what we're about to discuss. Colonel Levashov, a very important Russian publicist, and these are the three people, the first three people I would like to address one question. And then after that, everyone will join in this discussion, because this is really a very topical discussion, the cooling of the relations with the West and the price of this cooling of relations, because we have sanctions, we have counter-sanctions, and I'm confused already. I know a lot of people that are saying that the sanctions are the godsend. If it were not for the sanctions, we would have not done anything with the military-industrial complex, with the agriculture, so long live Obama. And others say, well, this is all a lot of bad thing. It's like diabetes, the onset of diabetes, when nothing is seeming, the level of sugar is growing, but life goes on. But in reality, the worsening of the health is happening. And I would like to address my question to Valery Garbuzov. Please tell me, our main strategic foe or partner, we couldn't really partner up, but what do you think about the status of the U.S.-Russian relations? I'm not going to ask you who's at fault, whom to blame. It's going to be up to the historians to decide that. But what's really going on and what can be done? Because this forum is aimed at trying to develop certain solutions using the surgeon's techniques. Well, Ruslan, the thing is, the response of the West and the United States in particular is the response or the reaction to today's foreign economic policy of Russia, or foreign policy in general, and Russia's desire to rework its foreign policy that goes back to the Yeltsin time and find another place in today's world on a different set of conditions. That's what caused this reaction. It was very tough, the response was, and I think it's a long-term response. It is a response that has become a reality of today's world. Just let's take a look at this. Over many decades, the Americanists and the practitioners would be saying that the goal is to expand our agenda, the agenda between Russia and the United States, to move it outside the negotiations about arms reductions or limitations, as was the case in the past, the limitations on strategic arms. What do we have now is this: the agenda of the U.S.-Russian relations is turned upside down. We have sanctions versus counter-sanctions, expelling diplomats, closing diplomatic facilities. And that's what we have to deal with. Can we call this agenda a constructive agenda? I doubt it. And this agenda is not something that can go too far. Secondly, the relations between Russia and the United States are revolving around two spirals. And they essentially get wound every day. That's the confrontational spiral and the sanction-based spiral. And they have turned into the two pillars of our interactions. These circumstances are exacerbated by the fact that the U.S. sanctions policy towards Russia, which is different from that of Europe, it is cemented by their laws, by their regulations, by their legislation in the U.S. Congress, and was put into law by signing by President Trump. And as the experience shows, when everything is going one way or the other, or in the similar way to what we are seeing today, it means that this course, which is a confrontational course, is here to stay. It's not for 1 year or for 2 years. It's not until the end of Trump's term. It's a strategic course aimed at restraining Russia as a response to its contemporary foreign policies and its behavior. And that's the reality we are confronted with today. Ruslan, back to you. You have a couple of minutes left. That's one thing. The other thing I wanted to bring up is this: our relations with the West in general. Generally speaking, it seems to me that the 21st century will be defined by a number of very important key aspects or points. The consequences of the breakup of the Soviet Union. As it turned out, it's not something that happened overnight. As it turned out, the breakup of the Soviet Union has led to the formation of a geopolitical vacuum in various regions of the world, in Europe, in the former Soviet space. And the vacuum cannot stay that. I mean, vacuum for a long time. And the fight for this, the struggle for this vacuum is on, and it will define the 21st century. The things like Georgia and Ukraine, Moldova are the signs of that struggle. And prior to that, we had our former Baltic republics of the Soviet Union. So as the experience has shown, there are states that have learned quite quickly to fill this space, and the United States is one such country. The other point, the other thing that will influence this century will be the rise of China. This is a unique phenomenon. The country which is now regarded as a challenge to the United States might, economic might, it has succeeded in becoming the second, according to some, the second superpower. Some people say it's too premature to say that, but it's in any case the country that has been able to find its own place in today's world and influence it in a different way, different to the influence of the United States, influencing other nations. And China has put together a very new model of interactions with the United States, which is based on the one hand, mutual influence and a mutual rejection on the other. And how will this model evolve? This is still an open issue. And the third moment is related to the perception of Russia in the West and the perception of West in Russia. Back in the 20th centuries and during the Cold War, Russia was building its relations with the West. We had pretty good economic relations even during the Cold War era. And now this tendency has broken. And the peril of that is that there are geopolitical differences, and we understand there are strategic differences of opinions, but now the focus is on the value-based differences, that there are Western values which are seemingly quite different from the Russian values, and they seem to be incompatible in that perception. And I think that is something that is alienating Russia from the West even further, although Russia is actually Europe, and without Russia's participation, many of European issues may not be resolved successfully. So we're now finding ourselves in a very difficult or complex situation, a situation I would call probably a moment of truth, the moment that should have come, but I think the critical mass for such a moment hasn't yet arrived. Thank you very much, Valery. What's interesting to note is what you mentioned about the various values and the differences between the values. But now I would like to give the floor to Colonel General Ivashov. But before that, I would like to apologize to Andrei Kortunov, who is the General Director of the Russian Council on Foreign Affairs, because he is the participant of that quartet that deals with the cooling of the relations. And we would also listen to him. And since we applauded every participant, we can applaud him as well. Well, so, Leonid, time, you have the floor. Leonid, 7 minutes is the time limit. What we are discussing today in this auditorium is the problem of the main threat to humanity, to mankind. Because all of these numbers that we have been given are important numbers, and this is important to do. But we need to understand the main threat both for Russia and the United States, China, and all the other nations. Today, it's a matter of whether in several decades there will be mankind still in existence, or whether the mankind will be wiped. And the main enemy of the Mankind is the global economic and financial model that everyone professes. These are just some of the facts that were mentioned in the address by 115 scientists from 194 nations. This was done this year. They are saying that today the world ocean is being turned into a dead body of water. It is dying. Over the last 25 years, the emissions into the atmosphere have increased by 62%, and this affects the health and the well-being of people. Over the 25 years, the population of the Earth has grown by 2 billion, and the number of animals living on the Earth has reduced by 30%. And look at our examples. The Baltic Sea, the Black Seas are the dying seas, and they're going to be dangerous not just for swimming, but also for living nearby. The Aral Sea is gone. The Caspian Sea is now covered with a thin film of oil. Look at the millions of square kilometers of the taiga, the lungs of the planet. They are being cut down, and the timber sold to the neighboring nations. And today, the scientists are crying out loud. And I agree with that. If we do not change this financial and economic model of the world, mankind will cease to exist. On top of that, mankind is increasingly approaching its end. Look at all of the best things that are being invented by our scientists, and everything that we do that is immediately turned into a weapon to exterminate your neighbors. The climate is a weapon, genetics are a weapon, and we are still developing weapons that are based on new physical principles. What are wars for, and who orders them? The First World War, the Second World War, and hundreds of conflicts afterwards. Why are they fought? Who do they serve? Who is the main customer of that? And that is the financial capital, the oligarchs. You call them whatever name you choose. And the dominance of finances as the main purpose in life, that changes the purpose of a human being. And that digital economy that we're talking about, it is something that will change the conscience of the people. The vocabulary are getting increasingly weaker and smaller, and we'll be acting like robots probably, but we'll lose our souls, we'll lose our spirituality and sensitivity. Plus, we are getting braced for maybe nuclear conflict. Well, they say God is going to save us. God have been creating conditions for the existence of every living being on this planet for millions of years, this unique planet. God will help us with the path that we've chosen. Maybe a volcano will erupt or something happen similar to that, or maybe a meteorite will hit the Earth, because man, in this system of the life cycle where everything is in harmony, where everything is in balance, everything is developing for the new order of harmony, the man is destroying everything around him, the environment, all the living beings, and so on. So it seems to me that what we need today is talk about not the improvement of these economic models with millions of poor people without access to good water or food. Instead, we should focus, and our scientists in economics should focus on, would be a new model of surviving, survival of humanity against the backdrop of this catastrophe that we are facing. We should talk about the new purpose of our lives, or maybe returning to the traditional purposes of life? Should we live for the sake of inflation parameters or pleasures, maybe? That is probably the main threat and the main challenge that we have to address. Another moment I wanted to address, you know, everything in this universe and on this planet, everything is interconnected systemically. And so the universe is rotating, the space is rotating, time is rotating, and time is cyclic. And what is happening in Russia now is a repetition of what we saw in 1970. Things repeat themselves at the new spiral. General, you have 1 minute. This is changing, and the world is changing. The Western world is changing. Even how the sun is going up and down. And now the era of the West is about over, and the era of the East is coming in. And only the intellectually minded states that bring fairness and justice will succeed. Thank you. What you have been talking about is very close to me, especially when you talked about the main threats that we're now faced with, we as mankind. And that main threat is man itself. And we all understand that those factors that General was mentioning, was alluding to, are real facts. We would also want to talk about this at the end, but since we started talking about this, I would like to emphasize that in order to stop this degradation of the environment or the extinction of species and the global warming issues, we need to make sure that the peoples cooperate, but we don't see that. It's just the opposite. People are widely apart. So I would like to go back to this. Why is this happening? Why did we lose that world, those hopes that we had back when we were beginning our perestroika? Let's look at the Paris Charter. We were getting ready for living in a different world, a world without the zero-sum game, without any mutual threats, so that we could concentrate on solving common problems. I would like to give the floor now to our colleague from China, because China represents 1.5 billion people. I was recently riding in a cab, in a taxi, and I saw a big billboard. It said, there is a new Chinese restaurant about to open. And okay, that's fine. It's not a new thing. But in big letters it said, please come to this address, street so-and-so, building so-and-so. And it said, 1.5 billion people can never go wrong. Is that really true, Mr. Wang? What do people think about the cooling of our relations with the West? And what position is China taking here? What do you think in terms of things that are good, things that are bad? And do you like our spat, our fight with the West, or are you unhappy with that? Please.
Thank you. My name is Wang Wen. I'm so honored to be here. This is my second time to join the Moscow Economic Forum. So actually, these days, in the past few weeks, I'm very, very busy because as a think tank scholar, as you know, China, as Russia did, we have the new administration. President Xi Jinping consecutively become the new president, and he organized a new government. And also, as a think tank scholar, we are very busy to consult for our new government. And a very hot and a new topic for our think tank scholar is that, because this year is our 40 years anniversary of reform and opening up policy. 40 years ago, China is very, very poor. And now China become the second largest economy, the largest e-commerce market, the largest demand market, the largest middle income class in the world. Why? Even ourselves, as a Chinese scholar, we are very puzzled about our country's development, so quick development, so quick rise. But on the other hand, why I come here? Because my good friend, Dr. Sigrid Glasif, because in the past 2 years, Dr. Glasif and me established a new dialogue channel between Russia and China. We promote the economic dialogue between Russia and China and promote and enhance the mutual understanding between our two countries. So I think that not only China is rising, but also Russia is rising too. So my key topic today is core renaissance or core rise of Russia and China. So I think, yes, no any suspect from West to rise of China, but a few suspect on rise of Russia. If you read of the Europe newspaper or United States newspaper, there are a lot of criticism to Russia. But I have a lot of American friends. I often persuade them that I think, okay, please trust, Russia is rising now. Compare to Japan, compare to Western Europe. So I make the PPT that the first point I want to share with you is that Western countries should believe that China and Russia are veritably rising. Look at this map. Of course, in the latest 3 or 2 years, Russia's economy a little unstable. But compared to 18 years ago, Russia's economy doubled, right? Maybe at least doubled. So that's my personal opinion, Chinese scholars' opinion. And additionally, Chinese was convinced more than a European country or United States country that we respect Russia as an enhanced great power in the world. So of course, we very appreciate Russia's help, Russia's contribution to China history. But compared to the national giving from heaven, Russia is an inherent great global power. The land, number 1. Resources, number 1. Pure water, number 1 or number 2 in the world. So I think that don't suspect Russia rising. When I have a speech or when I have a presentation in DC or in London, so I often persuade my European or United States friend that respect Russia now, as China did. That's the first point I want to say. The second point I want to say is that Western countries underestimate the contribution of China, Russia in the world. In the past 5 years, China-Russia's relationship increased, make progress very, very quickly. In the past 5 years, President Putin and President Xi met more than 20 times and make very, very good friends, close friends. Think it over. How many friends you met in the past 5 years? Right? This is very easy to know. So I think that Russia-China relationship nowadays is a model of great powers relationship. So we united. We have a very, very many similar strategic points. And also, more importantly, that look at, I suspect, I criticize the Western media, because in Western media, they often describe China and Russia as a troublemaker. No, I don't think so. Russia and China are not troublemaker. Look at the past 20 or 30 years. There are so many trouble. Terrorism, Syria war, Afghanistan war, Iraq war, financial crisis, mass shorting, so many trouble. No any troubles were from Russia and China. And China is a positive, China and Russia is a positive power in the world. So my conclusion is that the world should support the joint rise of China and Russia, because the China and Russia are the positive power in the world, and the two countries can maintain the world peace as well as the world development. So in the future, we should have we should continue and maintain the cooperation, strategic cooperation. Especially, China has a One Belt, One Road, and you have the Euro-Asian initiative. And if the two countries united, we can make much bigger contribution to the world. That's my opinion. Thank you so much. Thank you.
What can I say now? Well, we really would like to be happy in this life and about this life. The two nations, China and Russia, are friends, are strategic partners. But it is something what the United States shouldn't like now. That's why I would like to ask Mr. Kortunov, who is an experienced analyst and who is also the one who can look inside and behind the curtains, what is happening in our relationships with the Western countries. I think it's kind of poker game when you would like to increase your bets when every single country would want the other country to capitulate, but it is not possible in principle. Where do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? Can we really come back to more or less normal relations? Or will this situation keep going and this cold face can turn into something which can be even much more worse? Well, thank you, Ruslan. I would like to start with a small joke, but unfortunately this topic is not something we can really laugh at. And my joke is, probably many of you have already heard it before. A doctor calls his patient and says, "We looked at your analysis and I've got two news for you. One of them is bad, another one is very bad. Let's start with the bad one. You know, your current situation is very bad. You are in urgent need of operation within the upcoming 3 days, otherwise you die." And what is the very bad news? And the very bad news, that is actually the day 3 when I'm trying to call to reach you by phone. And everything what is happening now between Russia and the United States reminds me this joke when the doctor has been trying to reach the patient for 3 consecutive days. And this is a difference to the Cold War times in 1970s. And if you remember that times, we were much more serious at that time to the security, to the nuclear threat. And at that time, the leaders and the societies understood the responsibility towards the future generations. And now we are living in a post-modern world. Oh, there are some other reasons. I also do see that these problems are taken not so seriously as it was 40 years ago. And that's very dangerous. If we compare this situation with the Cold War, that is not the Cold War of the 1970s, when we had the treaties, when we had the control infrastructure, when we had the verification, when the rules of the game were clear. Now, this is the Cold War of 1950s, when we didn't have any red lines, when no party knew what the other party was going to do, when the weapon race was not limited by anything. So this is something what we should take into account. We can certainly discuss whether it is really logical to use the Cold War term now. But nevertheless, we need to take into account two moments. The current situation has more hope to cooperate with Europe than with the United States. I graduated from the Institute of the United States and Canada. I don't want to make this kind of confession, but I'm sure it would be easier for us to cooperate with Europe in the nearest future. And the next moment is the model of a hybrid car as a model for the future cooperation between Russia and the West. First of all, we need to restore this internal combustion engine. So we need to restore those institutions, mechanisms, and procedures which helped us to avoid the real world war in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. But now we're living in the 21st century. So in addition to this combustion engine, we need a new electric engine which will allow us to keep the cooperation in science, culture, education, civil society. Because no matter how worse our relationships with the West can become, Russia will stay #1 in the world in terms of number of Schengen visas issued. The European Union remains the main trading partner for Russia. There are more Russian students at every single European university than from other countries of the world. The Russian communities are well presented in the European countries. We can also think about the old model, which already kept its functionality and can be used in the nearest future, but we shouldn't forget that this new model will also have a right to exist, and it can also be useful, and we should be interested in transitioning from the gasoline or diesel engine to the new electric engine, because the number of common problems will only grow, and the agenda which we inherited from the Cold War only is shadowing the new agenda, the agenda of the 21st century, and it will create problems for all of us. And the last thing I wanted to tell you, because I'm limited in time, we will come back to it in the second round. And I would like to react on this very important topic which was sent by Mr. General. That's the environmental protection, the climate, how the mankind respects the environment. The Western countries implemented not so long ago a large project in order to identify who from the global leaders made most of all in order to preserve the environment, climate, and the biodiversity. How do you think? Who was it? It's, I think, very difficult to guess, because after a very significant analysis was the Genghis Khan, because all other leaders were reducing the human population, and he actually eliminated whole civilizations, restoring the natural environmental balance. Why am I talking about it? The environmental problems are very important for us, but we need to search for the solutions for these problems, not in the past, but in the future. We should go forward, not back. It is not very comfortable. It creates risks, but we have no other way to go. Thank you. Thank you, Andrei. I didn't really understand the difference between the old version and the new hybrid relations. I want you to answer it. It's quite difficult to imagine for me when there is a mutual mistrust, the mutual threats. We can also improve the relationships in culture, in sports, in economy, in trade. I think it's quite difficult to imagine. You started talking about Europe. That's why I would like to touch the European part of our session. We have two representatives from the most important countries of the European Union, France and Germany. And it is all we used to think that the whole European Union is founded on the French-German cooperation. That's why I would like to ask them. So we have two representatives of the EU here, Thierry Mariani, the former Minister of Transport in France, honorary member of the French Parliament, and the president of the French-Russian dialogue. And Germany is represented by Falk Tischendorf. He is a well-known lawyer, spending a lot of time here in Russia and knowing everything what is happening here. He is a managing partner of a legal company in Moscow, and he also represents one federal state from Germany. I would like to start with Thierry Mariani. Please tell me, Mr. Mariani, was I right that it was very important to have a good cooperation between France and Germany in the current situation? Because you have also difficulties in your relations with the United States. And when Andrei Kortunov was talking about the chances to improve the relationships with Europe, probably he was thinking about that Europe probably already stopped being a slave of the United States. All this anti-Russian front, which was created straight after this Skripal poisoning in the UK, what can you tell us about the general situation in the world and how Europe is reacting on it? You are welcome, Mr. Mariani.
Thank you, President. Well, if the question is if there is a return of the Cold War in this moment between Europe and Russia, maybe I can say the same word than the Prime Minister in Great Britain, highly likely. Highly likely because the situation in this moment starts to become very difficult, I think, for a country like France and for all Europe. Normalized relation between Russia, United States, Europe to reinforce links. There are promises and ambition put forward of Soviet Union. Reality in the last moment is quite different. In the past years, relations between Washington, Moscow, and Europe have now a serious chill due to the interruption of dialogue about Syria, an agreement on nuclear disarmament, or suppression of Russian hacking attempts during the American campaign. With the election of Donald Trump at the White House, hopes of warming would have been possible. But unfortunately, tensions have risen again and again. Unfortunately, I said because the software is still the same. These tensions are palpable in Europe. European Union and Russia seems to be in a kind of devilish spiral. Jean-Pierre Chevènement, former French minister, has used this word to qualify the situation in 2014 when the European Union imposed several sanctions against Russia. Even if French ministers declare that the lifting of sanctions will be a good thing, the situation don't seem to be improving. The situation in Ukraine, the confrontation in Syria, the decision to exclude Russian athletes from the Olympic Games, or the recent expulsion of diplomats show that we are again in a sort of Cold War. In 2017, during the speech in the International Economic Forum of St. Petersburg, your president declared that the relation between Moscow and Washington has been the lowest since the Cold War. However, he recognized the importance of a constructive dialogue between the two countries. Is the relation between Europe can be different? Mr. President, honestly, I want to tell you yes, but unfortunately, when I saw the relation in this moment, even in my own country, I'm a little bit pessimistic. It's difficult for many persons to be in the shoes of the President de Gaulle, and it's difficult to be on the position of real independent politics. I just want in some minutes to underline one very important tool, the American law and the sanction. Law is now an instrument of economic power and foreign policy. Indeed, the law also taken a global significance and can be an instrument of diplomacy and international economic policy. International law contributes now more and more to the soft power. The United States of America assume the extraterritoriality of the law is a part of American supremacy. The United States has an external legal policy. So tensions have been exacerbated by international sanctions. We are in a global system where sanctions have had a serious impact, particularly on the international economic trade, on foreign policy in a general way. So I would say American practices concerning sanctions became a little bit abusive. In recent years, since 2008 to be precise, the colossal fines imposed on a European company make the headlines. French companies were particularly hit in 2014. The bank BNP Paribas accepted to pay a record amount of $9 billion for violating US financial embargoes against several countries. Under the effect of benefit of BNP Paribas, now European companies, for fear of American retaliation, are extremely cautious. They consult and verify that their activity do or not do fall within the scope of sanction. They are no longer want to take any risk. They are doubly penalized by the sanction and by the excess of prudence to avoid the fines that the United States applied to them. The American judicial system is extremely hard that contribute to tending international relations between Europe and Russia. And in my opinion, it became another dimension of Cold War. The Iranian example also shows that despite the agreement of the nuclear program, the reintegration of this country into the global economic and financial system.
Mr. Thierry, your time is practically, your time limit is over, but I'll give you 1 minute more for the first round here.
Yes, I know. I saw the time in front of me. If you want, I conclude very quick. I said to respond at the end of your question, I think in this moment the European, unfortunately, has not independent policy, and I make the constat that my country, like all the European countries, is completely on the same position than the American sanction. I think it's a mistake because Russia and Europe we have common interest, we have specified interest, and it's a moment where the American policy is maybe a little weaker than before to show that Europe can be an independent, powerful and independent politics in foreign policy. And we have now, there is a new government in Germany, there is a new government in France. I think it's the opportunity to show it very quick. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much. You touched a very important topic. How the American judicial system as a tool for bringing forward the US policy. But as far as I understand, never the Chinese, the United States don't like the international law, but the Europe likes the international law and tries to do something in order to comply with the international law. And I will give you the chance to answer my question later after the Falk Tischendorf. You said it is quite difficult to withstand this American pressure. Why the BNP Paribas had to pay this fine? I remember in the 1960s when France were less depending from the United States. It was a kind of enfant terrible in the Western world. I also remember Charles de Gaulle, who was not really liking the United States. Now the Europe is really separated, and there are few chances for Europe to withstand America. Probably that's my opinion. You can correct me if needed. And I would like to give the floor to Falk Tischendorf, who is a managing partner of Biden Burkhardt office in Moscow. Mr. Tischendorf, I would like to ask you, I really like Germany. I have been dealing with Germany for more than 50 years. I have a lot of friends in your country. I'd like to ask you directly. We always thought that Germany was economic giant and a political dwarf. My question is direct. Did the situation stay as it is or change? But you can also express your opinion on other issues we discussed today. Thank you, Ruslan. And now, after everything what was said today, I wanted to start with one moment which is crucially important for me, because the current situation we're in now is quite critical. Germany has now a special responsibility for these relations between the West and Russia. Now we have the question how Germany can influence these relations. I would like to remind you that Germany could not really exist without two people. Without President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. When we were talking about the German merger, because other European countries like United Kingdom or France, they were not really happy about this particular fact. Mr. Tischendorf, I apologize, but I know this story when Gorbachev and Bush had to persuade François Mitterrand and Margaret Thatcher to agree for the German merger. And Mikhail Gorbachev said it wouldn't be anything bad with this merger. And Mitterrand came to the GDR late 1980 or even in 1989 in order to sign a long-term treaty between France and GDR. I apologize for interrupting you once again. We had also a joke at that time when Mitterrand was said, why you didn't like Germany so much. He said, I really like Germany, that's why I want Germany to be twice, to be doubled. And I would like to point out once again that without it, Germany wouldn't exist now. And the question is, what have we done within the last 27, 28 years, and why are we currently in this situation? Now I would like to pay your attention to one particular event which is very important. In the year 2001, the Russian president made a speech in the German Bundestag, in the German parliament, and this speech was very interesting. And now we're discussing the conflicts we had. And if we talk about these conflicts, we need to understand what we did wrong and how we can come out of this situation, and whether we can really come out of this situation, and what role the economy plays in resolving this issue. So the President Putin talked for 5 minutes and the interpreters stopped working because Vladimir Putin decided to speak German. And he made two important moments in his speech of 2001. Moment one is to create one humanitarian space from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And moment two is to create partnership of security. Now we can ask ourselves what we implemented out of these two initiatives. In reality, nothing has come true. And the question is why it is so. I'm currently living and working in Russia, and I spent here many years, and I know that Ruslan and I had a similar event in Germany with a very intensive discussion how to resolve this situation. We also had another event within this Moscow Economic Forum, also here in Moscow, in the Moscow Chamber of Industrial and Entrepreneurs. It was in 2015. We said that we had to do our best in order not to allow this situation to happen. So now we have to admit we lost 3 years on what we did wrong. And another important moment is here, because there is one thing which is missing: how we talk to each other, how we communicate, because dialogue is important. We have lots of events when we talk a lot. The Russians say their opinion, the Europeans and the Americans say their opinion, then we leave the whole and nothing changes. What is really missing, that is the dialogue, because we need to understand not only what we say, but also what the other people say. And with this dialogue, it is important not only to express your own opinion, but also to explain what is behind your opinion. A successful dialogue means that you pay attention to your partner, and this is missing.
So we must be able not just explain ourselves and our behavior, but also accept the opinion of the counterpart. There are no authorities, no experts in the dialogue, or people that know always how to do things better. Everyone understands everyone. That's what's missing. And if you would allow me, I would say one more thing. The main issue may be is that there is a situation in the Crimea and the situation in Ukraine. We haven't made any progress there, not one step forward, either left or right. And it seems to me that if people in Germany might criticize me for this, but if we do not resolve this, and not with sanctions, God forbid, because there are so many issues that need to be dealt with, we need to think about this in this way. Maybe we should just, defer this until later, so that everyone could reach an understanding that somebody may disagree with a particular approach, let's say Europe or Germany, and then Russia could argue that they believe that they've done the right thing based on their understanding of the situation. So we should proceed from there and then come to decisions, because there are so many things we need to focus on and address. And it seems like my time is almost up. 2 more minutes. You have 2 more minutes. Thank you. So we need to understand that these problems can only be addressed if we work together, Russia with Europe and Europe with Russia. Of course, Europe will play a major role. We have to say this straight. So there are a lot of issues we are confronted with in Europe. But democracy, the form of our life, is now under question. I can really imagine that democracy, for many people, especially at the level of European Union, is too complex, too non-transparent, too confusing, and fairly long-term, and not always oriented towards a particular well-defined result. And so people may not directly experience democracy, and we need to be able to solve those issues in Europe as well. We have problems there. We have certain issues with our North American partners. Our relations have become more complicated. So I wanted to go back to what I said at the very beginning of my speech. Germany has, and that's my personal opinion, has its special responsibility for historical reasons. I don't have to explain any further. Responsibility before Russia. And we can ask a question. And Ruslan, I will go back to your question later. The question is, how much can Germany influence this? Yes, we do have a new government, and the same goes for France and other nations. Although, as we now understand, the United Kingdom is now leaving the European Union. But within the EU, we have 28 nations now, which means that Germany cannot work unilaterally to make decisions. Thank you. Mr. Tischendorf. So, you see, this is a romantic position, the one expressed by Mr. Tischendorf. I've been blamed for being too romantic in Germany and here. They say, you think that the world can be so pastoral, and Gorbachev showed that this is all a lot of bull, and this is just a historic zigzag. We're all fighting for spheres of influence. That's how it's been, that's how it is, and how it's going to be. It's very sad to know that maybe we are programmed to compete at all times, both within the country and outside. There is egotism related to the free market, and that is something that pushes out collectivism, and then you don't care about the environment, nor do you care about dumps and waste. We could go on forever ad infinitum on this, but I would like to address our great political activist and a very good economist, Grzegorz Kalotka, who was today declared to be the foreign member of the Russian Academy of Science. He's a person of history in many senses, not in the Gogol sense when he called Nozdrev a historical person. Why historical? Because he's always getting himself into dubious histories. This is a really true man of history, because when we compare the transformation in Poland and transformation in Russia, we're saying that there's a lot of things in common. We started out with empty shelves in the stores, and they had their own gaidar. His name was Balcerovich, and we had our own gaidar. And then Poland started going down the path of democracy. They believe that the change of the executive leader is an important thing, because power can be sweet. When you got to the power, you don't want to cede it. So the Poles decided that they would swear that they will leave if they lose the elections, which is not the case with the other large country, which didn't follow that example. And that's why we didn't have our own Kolodko, who would come after Gaidar and would fix things, as it did after Primakov came, but that was just a zigzag. And Grzegorz, I wanted to ask you not about the economy, but rather about a different thing. Poland is one of the toughest critics of today's Russia. And that's already a great feat of yours, that Grzegorz Kolodko, the former vice prime minister of Poland. But it doesn't really matter, because there are no former vice prime ministers. He came here. That's nearly a heroic feat, because he's going to be lashed out at for, selling his soul to the Bolsheviks. So, Grzegorz, no one has said what can be done. I don't really like discussing things without offering a path forward. What do you see as a social thinker, a political activist, and a politician? What can be done? Both parties are waiting for the other party to capitulate, to surrender. They will not see that to happen. Maybe there will be a hot phase in this conflict. What would make sense to do here? Maybe create a non-governmental movement uniting Polish, German, Russian, American NGOs, somehow pushing the politicians towards reaching a minimum consensus. Please, the floor is yours. When I came yesterday, there was not a single place that was vacant at the Polish airport. It means that Poles are coming here to Russia. The question is, why would they come here? Primarily for business reasons. Also, there are also cultural ties and a lot of tourists and scientific ties. What do we need to do? We need to move forward. We need to run forward, because this is a long-range affair. And I think we need to change the bosses here in Moscow and in Warsaw, because the bosses do not want to reach an agreement. As for the next generation, we need to tell them that we are neighbors. And just the pure logic suggests that we need to support good relations between the good neighbors for now. But not like Mother Russia. What we did, we have been walking towards the West over the last 30 years. We didn't cede a single square meter of our territory, but we became a Western country. But our relations with our Western partners, with Brussels and Washington, over the recent years have not been the best. And I'm not just looking at this from the Polish point of view. I'm looking at this broader, from a broader perspective, from the standpoint of globalization. And as an economist, a theoretician, a practitioner both, and the researcher, and also a politician, as Ruslan has just alluded to me, it is very important for me to realize that this is a major issue for the economy. And the issue is to become subjected to the geopolitical interests. And now the best of the best depend on other opinions. This is a difficult period for the economy because it's really hard to talk to these fools because the economic arguments do not work with them. They don't work in Washington, D.C., nor do they work, unfortunately, in Moscow round the clock. Nor do they work in Poland, of course. And for the economists, this is a very difficult situation because you need to find an argument, some reasoning that would suggest that not just the economy would be based on knowledge of the science, but also, as I was explained when I was getting this diploma, it's also policy-based. I think that first and foremost, globalization is not irreversible. We could still set up a seminar or deliver lectures on an annual basis at the Moscow State University about this, whether it exists or not. And there could be different points of view, including that of President Trump, the White House. Maybe that's not the case, because what he does is not something that I would give a good mark for when I was grading first-year students at the economic department, because what he's doing is foolish from the standpoint of economics and long-term interest of the United States. And what is continuing now is the second Cold War, as I call it. Together with Mr. Gorbachev 30 years ago, 28 years ago, we ended the Cold War, the original Cold War. And then we didn't have it, and now we are having it again. People are saying this is the second World War, the new nationalism, new protectionism, trade wars. And what is going to be the future of Polish-Russian relations? And as far as Russia's place is concerned in this irreversible globalization, there was an answer that was given by someone here. 46 years ago, two boys came to Peking, Nixon and Kissinger, and they did a piece of work. They were able to drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and China, and now we're looking at a geopolitical game. The people do not understand what challenge it is for the world culture that is happening right now. And there are many challenges that one should mention, the environment and things like that. And so now there will be a wedge between, well, it's a question of whether there will be a wedge between Russia and China, whether the good cooperation will continue politically, economically, and along other lines between Russia and China. I would like to be an optimist, but I do not know that for sure. Mr. Xi Jinping said that the Chinese-Russian relations are probably the best in history, but the relations between the so-called West and Russia are the worst in history. And so the question is how the economic cooperation between Russia and China will continue, and India as well. Together, that's 29% of the world GDP. That's 30% of the world's population, China, India, and Russia taken together. And economic cooperation will go on. And if this cooperation continues, then there will be a different discussion in the world, because there will be soft power. And your power right now at Mother Russia is quite soft, and China already has soft power. And the West doesn't have a lot of that soft power because they make errors after errors. I'm talking about President Trump. I would say that as far as the improvement of the Polish-Russian relations would be the consequence of the improvement of the relations between the so-called West, which is also divided. The West is not something unified. The West is the European Union, which is divided, and also the United States, and the East, which is also divided. And the better those relations are, the better are going to be our international relations between the two nations of ours. But the matter is to make sure that the geopolitical would service the economy and not the other way around, which is currently the case, as is driven by the neoliberalist approaches and drivers. And this is what is called the neo-pragmatism, my new economic theory. Thank you very much, my dear Grzegorz. Let's give him a hand of applause. Well, the answer was very simple. You need to stop this geopolitical alienation of the two camps. If our spite with the West is over, then our spat with Poland is going to be over, and that sounds optimistic. But what can we do to make sure that happens? We have one more speaker. I don't know what to do next. This is a great Russian politician, a very brave, very smart, Oleg Shein, the deputy of the State Duma and the vice president of the War Confederation. I can tell you what we need to do. We need to ask President Putin to show all the Poles that we are your friends and that you can come to Russia without visas, and see what Poland would do. I will start doing that right away tomorrow. And now, Mr. Shein, I invited him, or Comrade Shein, I should say. He is responsible at this plenary session for a very significant threat. Degree-wise, it may not be as severe as the ones that we already discussed to this moment, such as Cold War, Cold Peace, multipolar chaos, or whatever term you can use to describe what's happening. I invited him to discuss disparity, to discuss injustice and inequality, but we don't have a lot of time for that. I would like to still hear about your attitude towards the discussion we've had so far. Since you are a person that doesn't deal with foreign policy, but you are still a deputy, a member of the parliament, what do you think specifically? Maybe you will come up with an idea of how to stop what's happening between now and the West. I would proceed from the title of our panel discussion, The Global World in the Conditions of Radical Changes. The humanity has always been in the situation of radical changes. We just need to understand what those changes are, because a crisis is just a way to relieve the tension. And if we don't do this, the crisis will go deeper. The very first thing that we need to start with would be to say that there is no single, separate French, Chinese, or Russian world. We're all earthlings. We are primates. We are Homo sapiens. We are part of the food chain. And if we are to look at our history, then we would see that it can be described by following the same causative links. And through the history of our civilization, neither education nor the energy approaches, they didn't influence in full the social status of the human being. Even back in the era of the bourgeois revolution, there would still be a lot of disparity between those who were the people working on land plots and the owners of those land plots. The 20th century was a century of a lot of changes. They were happening differently, but they had the same causation. And we need to understand those causes to understand why we are finding ourselves here amidst those confusions. The 20th century is the era when the middle class was being created. And it was the first time when the working person could afford, with the salary, to travel around the world, to obtain good education, so that we could continue developing a very good trading markets. And what is at the bottom of this is the redistribution of the wealth that had been created by people. 100 years ago, the share of the economy was about 10%. Now it's about 40–45%. I would like to remind you that in the U.S., The progressive tax rate was up to 98% in some cases. And there were nationalizations that were taking place in Britain and France and, of course, in Russia. What did this result in? It resulted in a very different planet where energy and knowledge could allow a person to climb up that social ladder. And because of that, the class of the poor changed. They moved up to the middle class. So 40 years ago, the situation started changing. Today, we're talking about the controversies and the conflict between the West and the East. We're talking about the right tendencies. We're now talking about the Islamist challenge, Papar and Gilan. But let's talk about another thing. What has been causing the well-being of the Western countries to grow has now stalled. And in some other cases, the level of living standards is dropping below 1960s in some cases. And so what is really happening is that what was underpinning these changes was the disappearance of large production facilities. So large groups basically disappeared, and atomization is taking place, and the service industry is coming to the forefront. And the trade unions were becoming more vocal, and therefore production was moved to the third world countries, such as South Asia, and therefore the salary stopped growing in the Western countries, and the growth of loans was the response. And we can see that the budgets started being debt-ridden. And when we watch those TV programs that say that in the US and in Europe the share of debt is growing, we need to understand, who do they owe? Nigeria, Botswana? No. They owe the money to the largest companies that are moving their capitals to the offshore zones, which is no secret to anyone. Russia is going through the same processes. We need to realize we are part of that. Over the last year, the internal debt of Russia grew by 3 trillion rubles, and that rate is going to continue, is projected to continue in the future. And our national economy in PPP terms is not really good. And cost of healthcare, we are at place number 98. In education, we are in different locations, in different places. I mentioned that in the first countries, in the developed nations, the taxes are supporting the model of loans for the largest businesses. In Russia, it's going to be the same. And the participants of another economic forum may say otherwise, but we know that there are companies that in our country have been given tax breaks until 2099. And the preferences are in trillions in Russia. And there are people in this audience are not the people that are using those huge preferences. So it means that if you have a gain somewhere, there will be a loss somewhere. And if we're talking about tax havens, tax paradises, and full waiver of responsibility before the society, that means there would be an overload somewhere. That's true anywhere you go. And our colleague from China spoke recently. Well, even in China, you have 200 million people. They have the salary, which is the same as the lowest class in the United States and in South Europe, which means that in China, this salary is not developing at a pace as it did in the 90s at 13%. Now it's down to 8%. So when we talk about inequality, it's not an abstraction. It's not a talk about some abstract things. What we are talking about is that we have the risk of returning back to the model that existed in the early 1920s, where neither the talent nor the education couldn't result in any breakthroughs. The society was cast in concrete and wouldn't be moving, wouldn't be progressing. And how do we address this challenge? In Europe, they were discussing this, how to approach this from different angles. I can see the time, how to prevent people from moving money into offshore zones. I think it's important to know that, but we need to start with the state. It's inappropriate that the government says, let's move the money out of offshores, but at Rosneft, they have 11 companies, and Gazprom has 7, Rosneft and the others have many other such companies in the offshore zones. We need to start with ourselves, and then the society will follow. Thank you very much. Quite surprisingly, we have exhausted the 2 or the 3 challenges of today: the Cold War, inequality, the environmental issues. Our time is over, but I remember that I asked several questions to some of the participants, including Mr. Thierry Mariani and somebody else asked you.
I asked you.
Me?
No. Marini.
No problem.
No special question.
It was an answer to the question of what to do. But do not ask a very difficult one. Ask a simple one, because we are facing a lunch break. And be quick, please. Nikolai Smirnov, Miloslavsky, the movement "Da Slovom Dela." The question for our foreign guests. I had an offer for the Foreign Office, for the Foreign Affairs Ministry, to create international emergency response military force, because whenever something happens, our planes would fly there and help is provided. So we contribute money to the United Nations, and every nation would have the right to obtain this international help. What do you think about such an approach? And the second, the history shows that at the beginning we studied the natural cataclysms. Now we are creating such natural disasters. Isn't this what the United Nations should focus on? That's a very right comment. I do not know what our colleagues would say about this, but I would not give them the floor, because as we were taught by D'Artagnan's father when he was leaving Gascogne to Paris. So he asked his father, how do I live there? He said to him, well, you're a smart lad, you will figure it out, but you have to follow 3 principles: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I don't know about you, but I really liked this session, and I think that we're going to continue today and tomorrow, and we'll have more in-depth discussions of the same issues that we just started touching upon. I would like to thank you all, and in particular for your attention. And of course, my thanks go out to the intellectuals who have given me a lot of food for thought. Thank you all for your participation, and I would like to wish you bon appétit. Thank you.